ADX Florence, Colorado, inside America's most isolated prison. There is no sound here that feels natural. Even the wind seems to hesitate before touching the walls. This place does not announce itself. It does not need to. From the outside, it appears almost unfinished. Concrete shapes pressed into the land, windows too narrow to serve any purpose except light without sight. Nothing moves, and yet something here is already watching. Only later do you understand that the silence is not absence. It is control. ADX Florence was not built to hold people. It was built to contain behavior. Every measurement serves a purpose. Every angle removes choice. Cells are poured concrete, floor, walls, ceiling, fused into a single idea: permanence. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. Even a shower shares the same unbroken surface. There is no softness here, not by accident. The architects understood something early. If you remove unpredictability, you remove hope. So the design does the work quietly. It narrows time. It flattens emotion. It teaches the body that resistance is expensive. Most men here will spend 23 hours a day alone in a space smaller than a parking spot. The remaining hour is not freedom, only a change in geometry. The first night is not the hardest. That comes later. The first night is confusion, the mind still full of outside noise. Memory hasn't yet learned its new boundaries. Men arrive here carrying old instincts. Conversation, movement, waiting for cues from other people. None of those instincts survive long. There is no one to read here. No footsteps to follow. No voices to mirror. The walls do not respond. They do not echo. They absorb. And slowly, the mind realizes something unsettling. It is alone with itself, completely, for the first time. Routine becomes currency. Wait time is fixed. Meal times are fixed. Lights follow rules that never explain themselves. The brain learns to measure life not in days, but in repetitions. Some men count meals. Others count steps from wall to wall. Some stop counting entirely, because counting implies an ending. Rules are not shouted. They are implied. Break a rule, and nothing dramatic happens. Privileges vanish quietly. Time stretches longer. This is how behavior is shaped here, not through force, but through subtraction. Waiting is the dominant activity. Waiting for meals. Waiting for light. Waiting for movement that never comes. Over time, waiting stops feeling temporary. It becomes a state of being. The mind adapts in strange ways. Thoughts loop. Memories sharpen until they hurt. Some men talk to themselves, not out loud at first. Later, volume becomes irrelevant. The danger is not madness. The danger is normalization. When isolation begins to feel ordinary, something essential has already shifted. Authority here is mostly invisible. Guards are heard more than seen. Instructions come through doors. Decisions arrive without explanation. This distance is intentional. When authority lacks a face, resistance loses direction. You cannot negotiate with a system. You cannot read its mood. You can only comply or endure consequences you will never fully understand. Fear here is not sudden. It is ambient. Like temperature, like pressure. Names matter less here than numbers. Histories flatten. Outside, identity is reinforced through interaction. Here, it must survive without witnesses. Some men cling to memory, replaying conversations, faces, arguments, try to preserve proof that they once existed beyond these walls. Others let identity dissolve because holding it costs too much. This is not surrender. It is adaptation. And adaptation, here, often looks like disappearance. Time behaves differently here. Without landmarks, weekends, seasons, events, days slide into each other. Years pass without ceremony. The body ages quietly. The mind adjusts expectations downward, not toward release, but toward tolerability. This is how endurance is learned, not through strength, but through shrinking the future. The most lasting effects of this place are not visible. They do not appear in incident reports. They do not always register as damage. They surface later, in fractured attention, dulled emotion, difficulty tolerating proximity. By the time a man leaves ADX Florence, the prison has already followed him, not as memory, as structure. The body adjusts before the mind understands what is happening. Muscles soften from disuse. Sleep fractures into shallow segments. Hunger arrives on schedule, not by instinct. Eventually, the body stops asking for things it no longer receives. Movement becomes economical. Gestures shrink. Even breathing changes slower, quieter, as if space itself were rationed. This is not discipline imposed from outside. It is discipline absorbed. The prison does not need to enforce stillness. Stillness arrives on its own. In isolation, thoughts are never interrupted. There is no casual distraction, no small talk to soften the edges of memory. Regret loops endlessly. Anger sharpens, then dulls, then returns in altered form. Some men replay the same moment for years, searching for a version that ends differently. Others avoid memory altogether, letting the mind drift into abstraction. Both strategies serve the same goal: survival. But survival here is not neutral. It changes the shape of thinking itself. Silence here is not peace. It presses inward. Without sound, the mind creates its own. Phantom footsteps, imagined voices, echoes of arguments long finished. At first, these intrusions are alarming. Later, they become companions. The danger is not hearing something that isn't there. It is needing it to be there. Anger cannot survive indefinitely in a place with no outlet. There is no audience, no response. Over time, anger exhausts itself. What replaces it is more difficult to name: a flatness, a distance from reaction. Men stop reacting not because they are calm, but because reaction has lost its function. This is often mistaken for compliance. It is something else entirely. Years accumulate quietly. Sentences here are not marked by milestones. No gradual easing. No clear progression. Time does not move forward. It settles. And with it, expectations shrink until they fit the cell. Some men stop imagining release altogether. Not out of despair, but efficiency. Hope, like everything else, must justify its cost. Human contact exists here, technically. Voices travel through phones. Faces appear behind glass. But connection requires more than proximity. Words flatten when there is no shared space. Emotion misfires when touch is forbidden. Over time, conversations become scripted, updates without depth. Loved ones move on. Life outside continues at a pace that cannot be matched. Eventually, even contact begins to feel like intrusion. The most complete form of control is internal. By the time a man has been here long enough, enforcement becomes unnecessary. Rules are anticipated. Movement is self-limited. Risk is avoided automatically. The prison no longer needs to act. It has already been learned. For those who leave, freedom is not immediate relief. Choice becomes overwhelming. Noise feels aggressive. Crowds feel unsafe. The mind, trained for confinement, struggles with openness. Some return to isolation by preference, not because they want it, but because it is familiar. This is rarely understood from the outside. When a man leaves this place, the cell remains identical. No record of adaptation. No trace of endurance. The prison does not change. People do, and those changes are not always visible, even to the ones who carry them. It is tempting to measure a place like this by what happens inside it. But the deeper impact unfolds elsewhere, later, quietly, in the way patience erodes, in the way identity narrows, in how silence becomes internal. This is not a story about punishment alone. It is about what prolonged absence does to the human mind, and how difficult it is to reverse. The walls do not follow you when you leave, but what they teach often does. Memory behaves differently after prolonged isolation. It no longer arranges itself chronologically. Moments repeat without order. Years compress into fragments. Some men remember the texture of concrete more clearly than faces. Others recall rules more easily than conversations. This is not forgetfulness. It is prioritization learned under pressure. The mind keeps what helped it survive, and quietly discards the rest. Emotion does not disappear here. It simplifies. Joy becomes unfamiliar. Sadness loses urgency. Fear settles into background noise. What remains is a narrow emotional range, efficient, manageable. Outside, this is often mistaken for coldness. Inside, it feels like control. The problem emerges later, when life demands reactions the mind no longer practices. Language erodes without feedback. Words are chosen carefully, not for clarity, but for safety. Tone flattens. Pauses grow longer. Eventually, speech stops serving connection. It becomes functional. This does not reverse easily. Conversation requires risk, and risk is what this place teaches you to avoid. Pause. After isolation, closeness feels intrusive. Bodies move too fast. Voices overlap. Eyes linger too long. The nervous system, conditioned for emptiness, reads density as threat. Some withdraw. Others lash out. Most simply endure, silently, until they can retreat again. This reaction is rarely anticipated. It is almost never prepared for. Even outside, structure remains. Routines form immediately. Objects are arranged carefully. Time is measured rigidly. This is not obsession. It is continuity. Chaos feels dangerous when order once meant survival. And so the prison persists, not as a building, but as a method. From the outside, adaptation looks like resilience. From the inside, it often feels like loss. The ability to endure extreme isolation is not neutral. It comes at a cost that reveals itself slowly. Patience replaces spontaneity. Control replaces curiosity. These traits are praised until they become barriers. Release is often described as an ending. For many, it is not. It is a transition without guidance. A handoff from one system to another that speaks a different language. The skills learned inside do not translate cleanly. Silence is no longer protective. Withdrawal is no longer invisible. The rules have changed, but the conditioning has not. Statistics can describe duration. They can quantify incidents. They cannot measure erosion. They cannot show what happens when time is experienced without variation. When the self becomes the only constant reference point. These outcomes resist clean documentation. They surface instead in patterns. Missed connections, repeated returns, quiet disappearances. The question is not whether isolation works. It does. The question is what it creates, and whether what it creates can ever fully re-enter the world it was removed from. This question has no clear answer, only consequences. Damage is often imagined as visible, something broken, something obvious. Here, damage is subtle. It hides in habits, in expectations, in what no longer feels possible. By the time it is recognized, it is already integrated. Places like this are easy to define by walls and rules, harder to define by aftermath. What happens here does not stay here. It travels, quietly, inside the people who leave, and long after the doors close behind them, the silence continues. This facility was designed with permanence in mind, not just structurally, but philosophically. Policies here do not bend easily. They accumulate. Each rule exists because something once went wrong, and instead of resolving the cause, the system sealed the response in concrete. Over time, flexibility was traded for certainty, and certainty became the objective. Many decisions that shape life here are made far from the cells themselves. Evaluations arrive through files, assessments through summaries. Language becomes abstract. Risk, management, containment. Words that make sense on paper. Less so inside a room where time does not behave normally. Distance simplifies responsibility. What was once exceptional becomes ordinary. Extended isolation stops being described as extreme. It becomes procedural. The longer it exists, the less it is questioned. Not because it is understood, but because it is familiar. Systems rarely reverse themselves. They continue until something external forces a pause. Survival is often cited as proof of effectiveness. If someone adapts, the system is said to work. But adaptation here does not mean restoration. It means learning how to function under narrowing conditions. Endurance is mistaken for health, and quiet is mistaken for stability. Those who work here also adapt. Distance becomes professional necessity. Detachment becomes skill. Training explains procedures, not consequences. Over time, routine shields everyone from reflection. This is not cruelty. It is insulation. For some, isolation ends abruptly. A transfer, a release, an aging body that no longer fits the model of threat. The system moves on easily. The individual does not. There is no decompression chamber for the mind, only expectation. What leaves this place does not announce itself. It blends in. The effects are mistaken for personality, for temperament, for choice. Few people ask what shaped those traits. Fewer still want the answer. Silence here was never empty. It was instructional. It taught patience without reward, control without relief, endurance without closure. Lessons that do not unlearn themselves. No image can capture prolonged internal pressure. No footage records the slow narrowing of thought. What matters most here happens invisibly, inside, over years. By the time it becomes visible, it is already settled. This story does not end. It pauses. The building remains. The routines continue. The silence holds. What changes is who carries it next, and how long it takes before the impact is noticed. This story does not end. It pauses. The building remains. The routines continue. The silence holds. What changes is who carries it next, and how long it takes before the impact is noticed. There is a temptation at the end of a story like this to search for balance, to weigh necessity against consequence, to close the distance with explanation. But some places resist resolution. ADX Florence does not exist to be understood easily. It exists to function. What it produces is subtle, incremental, often invisible until years later, and far away from these walls. The impact is not contained by concrete. It travels quietly, carried in habits, reactions, silences. And by the time it is recognized, it no longer looks like damage. It looks like a person. Nothing here has changed. The building is still. The routines remain intact. The silence holds its shape. This is how places like this endure, not through spectacle, but through repetition. The true weight of this place is not measured in years served, or cells occupied, or rules enforced. It is measured in what follows, in how long it takes to feel close to another person, in how difficult it becomes to sit with uncertainty, in how silence, once imposed, continues to echo. This is not a story with an ending, only a continuation.